So I'm going to assume this microphone is on. This is the fifth Great Lakes Conference, and in that time, I've had 4 different jobs and 4 different titles. But despite my best attempts to sort of get out from under doing this, Don is remorseless in tracking me down and making sure that I'm part of the conference every year. And I'm very happy to do that because it really does highlight the wonderful work that Central Michigan does on the Great Lakes and demonstrates our leadership in providing the scientific underpinning that's required to manage those valuable ecosystems. But today's panel, the first panel is about science. It's about policy. And although many scientists believe that policy should just be only informed by science, we know that that's not the case. There are many compromises that have to be made. And I'm very pleased to moderate this panel because we live at a time where there is a conscious sometimes, but definitely an erosion in the confidence of the ability of science and of the government to improve people's lives. Now, I think it was clear from Congressman Kildee's comments that there are people in Washington without whom our lives would be immeasurably worse, that they're working to protect our ecosystem and protect the economy, not only thinking about the short term, but thinking about the future. And the people on the panel today are the people without whom representatives and senators like Representative Kildee could not do their job. The people on the panel today are staffers who provide the engine for the senators and representatives in Congress. So I'd like us to acknowledge the work that they do at the end, which is invaluable. Now, everybody who lives in the Great Lakes Basin can agree that the Great Lakes are critically important to the ecology and economy of the region. But then the agreement breaks down because there are a whole multitude of stakeholders who have different and competing interests. So for example, a shipping company in Indiana is going to have very different interests than fisheries biologists in Michigan who's working to protect our ecosystems and fisheries from non-indigenous species. And the management of the Great Lakes is based on laws, local and state laws, but predominantly federal laws that are passed in Ottawa and in Washington, and in agreements, and as you heard earlier, sometimes disagreements between the governments of Canada and the United States. And as the people on the panel will, I'm sure, tell you, the legislative process is messy. It's like making sausages. And just like making sausages, there are parts of the process you probably don't want to look at too closely. Now, the difference is that most people like sausages. So even though they're messy to make, most people like to eat them. But inevitably, when you have a legislative process, the laws that are enacted don't please everybody. Some parties, sometimes more than one party, feel that the law doesn't suit them and should be different. And occasionally they get it completely right and they manage to alienate everybody all at the same time, which doesn't necessarily mean that the law is a bad one. It just means that they've pushed beyond where everybody can have, or anybody can have a consensus that it's a good law. So I think in summary what I'm saying is that although our legislative process isn't ideal, and you've heard some of that earlier on from Representative Kildee, without that process, without those laws, the Great Lakes would be immeasurably worse than they are today. There are lots of challenges and problems, but we need to remember that there are also a lot of challenges and problems that have been addressed because of the legislative process. And today's panelists serve on the staff of important and influential members of our federal delegation. They represent both political parties, and they're here to provide some information on current policy issues, what's happening in Washington, maybe give you some insights into how you can influence that process in the way that Representative Kildee mentioned. And they're also going to give you some information for the students in the room about how you could go to Washington and have the same kind of job that they had by telling you something about their story and about how they got to where they are today. So our panelists, now appropriately attired, is Jordan Dickinson. He was born in Grand Blanc, or Big White, in Michigan, and went to Michigan State, but everybody gets to make the occasional mistake. After college, where you got a major in public policy, so that's one route. And after college, he went to DC and began working for Dale Kildee, and then when Dale retired, he switched to Dan, where he's been working ever since Dan Kildee joined Congress. While he's been working for the Congressman, he managed to earn a master's degree in energy policy and climate from Johns Hopkins University. And for the Congressman, Jordan focuses on a range of issues, including drinking water, the Great Lakes, agriculture, energy, and education. Our second panelist is Eva Vrana, who is going to tell you about her new name when she gives her remarks. She received a Bachelor of Science in Applied Ecology from the School of Forestry, Resources, and Environmental Science in Michigan Tech. So a very different background. She did research on wolves and moose on Isle Royale, a study that's been going on for a long time and is familiar to anybody who's ever cracked an ecology textbook. And currently she is on the staff of Representative John Moolenaar for Michigan's 4th District. Thank you, Don. And her legislative portfolio includes natural resources, environment, energy, science, space, and technology, and a whole list of other things. But she is the lead staff person for the Chemistry Caucus, which is co-chaired by the Congressman. And then finally, but not least, is Aaron Suntag, who works for Senator Debbie Stabenow, who was here a couple of years ago. And Aaron has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Boston University and a dual Master of Arts in Business Administration and Government from Johns Hopkins University. For Senator Stabenow, Aaron advises her on environmental and energy policy issues, including those that come to her as in her role of co-chair of the Senate Great Lakes Task Force and a member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Finance Committee. So with that, I'd like you to welcome the panelists in the traditional way. And you can, if you have questions, they're happy to entertain questions afterwards. You should either write them down on a card, hand them to somebody, we'll read them out for you if you're shy, or stick your hand up and ask for a microphone, and we'll let you ask the question directly yourself. So with that, Jordan.
Okay, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thanks to President Davies for my new shirt. Surprisingly, he found the right size in like all 5 minutes, so congratulations to him for that. So when Dr. Zarate, we were coming up here, I asked him, what would you like me to talk about? And he said, just talk about how great Central Michigan is. And I said, no, well, that'll be easy. So we kind of talked about, this won't be about science, but the Congressman kind of hit on this. And a lot of what we do, I know very well the legislative process, how to get some bills passed and how things work in the Capitol in DC. But a lot of times we have to depend on science and scientists to understand what's going on and inform our public policy. So I just want to give you a couple examples of how Central Michigan has played an integral role of helping inform me about policy and kind of understand some of these really tough questions. As you saw from my background, I have a undergrad in public policy, a master's in energy policy, but really a lot of the biology, ecology, ecosystems, I really need to depend on the experts here at our universities to help inform our decisions. So let's see, in August, the Congressman and I, we went up to Beaver Island to the research center up there, and we've been talking a lot about zebra mussels, quagga mussels, and invasive species. And kind of some of the things that we hear about this is complicated, that the lakes have a lot of biomass in there, which is good for fish stocks, but it makes the water look really dirty. So since the mussels have been here, it's been cleaning up the water. And what does that really mean? And for the quality of the lake. And so Dr. Zarski kind of took us on one of these submarine robots with a video camera attached and kind of drove it around in the water column and saw that there's really not much biolife in the middle of the water column. All of it is settled down on the bottom. And, you know, unless you really go out there and see it and have someone who explain to you what that really means, it's hard for us to inform, like, how are we going to determine what sort of legislation we're going to try to pass to clean up the Great Lakes. So what he explained to me is that, you know, they take a significant part of the energy out of the ecosystem, and that the ecosystem will kind of balance out in the future. But without his firsthand knowledge and information, I really wouldn't have known exactly what all this meant and how these invasive species were impacting the lakes. You know, in some ways, I was out with USGS, I think a week ago, and they said that Lake Huron now is the clearest lake. That's made, and typically we would think of Lake Superior as the cleanest lake. So that was some surprising information that I depended on the scientists to tell me. Another example, again with Dr. Zarski, is grass carp. So something that we've been focused a lot on. We know that grass carp are in Lake Erie, but we don't really know that much about it, about where they are, and it's kind of this big puzzle we're trying to figure out. So some of the technology they have here right at Central Michigan has been helpful to figure out where these grass carp are breeding. And if we figure out where they're breeding, we can help essentially eradicate them. So what we found is that in the grass carp, they have or I guess a lot of fish have this small bone called an otolith. And essentially the otolith is like tree rings on a tree where it kind of, every year it has some sort of unique indicator where this fish had been. And so what we were able to decipher is by taking out these small fish bones, otoliths, and analyzing them through some really complex machine that I still don't understand, even though Don's tried to explain it to me 3 times. You can figure out a unique marker about where these fish have grown up. And because of that, we were able to take the whole entire Lake Erie ecosystem and pinpoint 2 rivers, the Sandusky and the Maumee in Ohio, and find out that's where the grass carp were breeding. And we can focus our efforts there and our funding efforts, most importantly from a congressional perspective, to decide where we're going to use resources to try to eradicate them. So, like I said, Central Michigan's been a great supporter in a lot of our public policy decisions, and I will continue to work with them and inform more of our decisions. So I'll hand over to Ava.
Well, thank you for hosting. And just by way of background, touched on it in my intro. I graduated from Michigan Tech in 2014 from the School of Forest Resources and Environmental Sciences with a specialization in applied ecology. So while I was an undergrad at Michigan Tech, I had a really strong connection with Isle Royale, and I'm sure some of you have probably been there. It's a very, very beautiful place. So a lot of my undergraduate work was based off of what could get me engaged with the island and get me out there in the summer. So 2 of the programs I worked on, one was the wolf moose study, and I did that during my undergraduate work, and mostly it was data entry in the lab, and I also did a moose watch expedition, so that's data collection, collecting moose bones. And then I was also a Park Service, just an internship, and I helped with a snowshoe hare population dynamics study that they were working on. So I really, in my undergraduate research, focused on more of the hard science. And around the time of my senior year, I joined the Demmer Scholars Program through Michigan State University. And in that program, they send you to Washington, D.C. for a fellowship. And I worked in the Office of the Secretary and Policy Analysis at the Department of Interior. Following that, I interned with Congressman Benishek and transitioned into a hired position. And then upon election of Congressman Moolenaar, moved into Congressman Moolenaar's office in 2015. So I have been working now on Capitol Hill for 4 years. Often one of the questions I get is that transition from more of a hard sciences background into the policy. My interest in that really started senior year, mostly because you get to that point, as an undergrad, and you're sitting there thinking, okay, what's next? And because of the Demmer Scholars Program, I do credit a lot of my career path from that program, because I was able to go to DC and see what the policy side was about, and I fell in love with it. So scared my parents a little because I decided to stay in DC with no permanent job or anywhere to live, and then was able to secure that position with Congressman Benishek. So it worked out in the end. I have found that having this science background, it's quite a unique background on Capitol Hill, has been helpful both for my career path and interest in natural resources, as well as the congressman that I have worked for. And quite frankly, when I was in college, I didn't even know a job like ours existed. So I really felt like I found that happy medium of, being engaged in the science and my job and having that policy. And DC is a great city to live in. So as was mentioned, my legislative portfolio is got a wide variety there, everything from labor, health and human services and education to natural resources and environment and energy. I don't like to say I'm biased, but that's definitely my favorite portfolio is the natural resources side just because of my background. And Congressman Moolenaar is a member of the Appropriations Committee. So a lot of my job and day-to-day life consists around the appropriations process. And this role that the congressman has on appropriations has been very valuable for the state and for the delegation, is a way to ensure these funding priorities that have been mentioned several times now, like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, are being met. And it's actually been about 10 years since a Michigan member has sat on that committee. And it is a great access point for staffers like us to make sure that these funding priorities are secured for our state. So I look forward to any questions you guys have as well.
Well, thanks. Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me today. And before I start my remarks, I just want to thank all of you in the audience and what you are doing. And I can imagine that sometimes it may seem hard to see how the work you are doing is necessarily making its way into public policy and federal decisions, and they're very complex. And I think there is some rightful frustration to that. But I will tell you, as someone without a science background, that the role you play in enabling me to provide my boss with the information she needs to go to work and do the things on environment, energy, Great Lakes issues, invasive species is pivotal. And so thank you for the professors who have dedicated their career to this. Thanks to the students who are getting into this and know you are making a fundamental difference, although it may not always feel that way and it may be a little bit slower than some of us might like, but just know how important that is. For my background, I did a little bit backwards. I guess I'm the graybeard up here. I came to Washington. I graduated undergrad in 2000 in the spring, and I came down to Washington, and I ended up working for a consulting firm. So I did it backwards. I was in the private sector for 9 years where I did a lot of environment and energy stuff. I then moved on to a senator from North Carolina. Her name was Kay Hagan, and I worked for her for 5 years before joining Senator Stabenow's staff about 4 years ago. It is without grandstanding for my boss, it is an honor to work for a member like Senator Stabenow, who, as a member of Senate leadership, as a former chair and now ranking member of the Ag Committee, as a senior member of the Energy Committee, which deals with a host of issues that are important that you deal with every day when it comes to ecology. The Finance Committee, which deals with tax incentives that hopefully we can use to spur some technology development in the Budget Committee. Enabling her to do her job, or helping, I play a very little role in just giving her the ammunition to do what she does so well. She is a legislator's legislature. And, I won't go through, I think many of you are familiar with the work she's done on the Great Lakes, but, she authored the GLRI program back in 2008 and 2009. and very happy to have been able to defend funding. We have worked very closely with our friends in the House on issues about lead and PFAS. She has been fighting on Asian carp for as long as she's come to the Senate, and probably, I'm sure, actually dates back when she was in the House before coming to the Senate in 2000. Ballast water issues, conservation title of the Farm Bill. The 2014 Farm Bill, which she authored, was the first time that Title II, which is the conservation title, had more mandatory funding than what most people think is in the Farm Bill, which is Commodity One, the crop insurance. Folks really see the Farm Bill as a primarily crop driver. Well, Title II, conservation, because of Senator Stabenow, now has more annual mandatory funding than any other title in the USDA's budget. And so those conservation programs are critical to the work you're doing and also for the health and well-being of the Great Lakes. I don't want to spend too much time talking. I would actually prefer to take any questions you have, but thank you very much for having me. Thanks. I enjoy sitting with my House colleagues. It's as a Senate staffer, it's a little bit hard going last. It's a little bit, from the upper chamber, it's difficult. So, but no, we work very well. And one other point I'd like to leave you with: when you watch TV, and you watch the news, boy, you think people are just at their throats. And there's some issues that that parties that have fundamental disagreements. But I will tell you, one of the honors of working for Senator Stabenow, one of the things I didn't appreciate versus coming from a North Carolina Senate office and Michigan office, is the way that Great Lakes issues bring together members of the House and the Senate, Republican and Democrat, in a way that I don't think any other environmental issue out there does in the United States Congress. And it is, and that is a reflection of the priorities that the people in Michigan, the people of all the states in the Great Lake Basin, put on the Great Lakes. And so it is actually, when there are so many places when it comes to the environment that seem so contentious and so partisan, that doesn't apply to the Great Lakes. And it is really refreshing. And so thanks for this opportunity, and I sure am happy to answer any questions you might have.
So let's put on your thinking caps, think about questions. But I'll start out with one, and I'm going to ask you to suspend disbelief and imagine that I'm what I once was, I think, a young, idealistic student. And I want to go to Washington and do the kind of jobs you do. But I don't really know anybody. How would I get started? How do I become, not you, sort of get into the kind of role that you're playing, apart from going and living there and horrifying your parents by being unemployed and having nowhere to live? So why don't you just go down the...
Okay. I think there is a lot of options. I think what Ava said is probably not uncommon, where you just kind of go there and hope that a job gets open. There are a lot of people who want jobs on the Hill. There's a finite amount, and honestly, a lot of the time it's about timing, whether it's the election, where you'll see a lot of new jobs, or when someone decides to leave the office. I think the best thing to do, though, is to volunteer and or intern. So if you're interested, volunteer for your home member here in Michigan if you don't want to come to DC, or go volunteer or come all the way to DC. And there's a lot of internship and grant opportunities to help you pay for housing. So I would encourage you to go to DC. And you don't know if you're going to like it or not. If you're interested in it, you can go there. I think in the end of the day, no matter if you want to go into being a scientist, if you want to go into private business, I think having an internship on Capitol Hill looks amazing on your resume. Even if you never want to work in politics again in your life, it's a high pressure environment with a lot of smart people that you can learn a lot from, and would be a really valuable experience. So I encourage you to just try it out, and you don't have to come all the way to DC. Every single member of Congress, even your state legislature also, all have offices in their districts or back in Michigan. So I would encourage you just to reach out, get your resume polished up and a cover letter, and send it in, and try that way.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little bit to that. That was a perfect description. But I will add that each congressman usually has their own internship program. So if you are in the district of a congressman, or are in the state even and are interested in doing that, you can usually find their internship program right on their webpage, or call the office. So it's not all that difficult. internships are generally run by college semester. Usually interns are in college, so we try to make it as convenient as possible to bring in college students. So.
Yeah, no, I think my friends to my right said it most. I think one thing to remember, though, is, it's very interesting when you come to D.C. There is no, you think, at least I did. I'll just speak for myself. I thought, okay, I got out of school. This is how this is going to go. Then I'm going to go here, and then I'm going to go here. And I got to tell you, most of the time the path isn't linear. And so if you're interested in public policy, there are a host of ways to get involved. And, we have interns. I think an internship program is fantastic. I think there are a number of fellowship opportunities, and that can be on the Hill or off the Hill. There are a lot of groups that are doing work that can be at the agency. I think the best way to go is if you want to, if public policy is something you're interested in, dive right in. And even if it's not something, maybe if it's not an issue that maybe you thought, boy, I never thought this would be interesting. I mean, I work on issues all the time that I say, boy, how is it that I'm working on this issue? This was not something I ever thought I'd be working on. And you get involved, you get into it, and it turns out those issues are fascinating and interesting more than you ever could know. And so go in with an open mind, get your foot in the door, and move forward. I would say, and I don't want to speak for my colleagues here, but I think one of, if not the best parts of working on the Hill is working with people like my friends to the right who are very smart, are very dedicated, driven, hardworking, and it's just wonderful being around a place where that you have an opportunity to be exposed to such intelligent and passionate people who are interested in making a difference in public policy. And so you come on down, try it. You may like it, you may not, but if that's something that interests you, I would highly recommend giving it a shot.
It's probably worth pointing out to students who may not be aware of this is the university does have a Capital Scholars Program run by the Government Relations Office. Toby Roth has stepped out, but you could contact that office, and that provides, I think, some travel and opportunities to work in Lansing in a variety of offices. So that might be a good way to start if this is something you're interested in. The questions, are you going to read them out, Don?
I have a question for Ava. I heard they plan on reintroducing more wolves to Isle Royale. They're down to one, I think. So could you kind of shine a light on what processes must occur, like the steps they need to take in the government for a federal decision like that to be made as far as moving species from one location, either it being native or non-native, to the Great Lakes region?
That's a really good question. So I will be honest, I haven't been as engaged on it through my office just because we're in, mid-Michigan for our district for Congressman Moolenaar. I do believe that they have introduced wolves. We were in fact just talking about this before we came in. They've started the process already, but they had to do an environmental study through the Park Service to evaluate, the potential outcomes of reintroducing. So there is a process through the Park Service. I don't know was your office engaged on it at all? Yeah, that's what I thought.
We had worked with Senator Peters in particular, and also other members of the House delegation. But this issue came to light. It's been a longstanding issue for a while, but really, I would say about 3 years ago is when it really started to pick up some momentum in terms of the Park Service's decision about whether or not they were going to proceed with this process, and that is a long process. There are NEPA requirements, but they have completed that. There's public review. All of that took some time, but now, yes, they are. I understand flew in 2 wolves already, and so plan to continue doing that more in the coming seasons.
Questions?
I guess I'd direct this at Jordan because this was something that was brought up by Congressman Kildee. He talked about he'd like to see an increase in Great Lakes shipping. However, shipping on the Great Lakes is the preeminent vector for invasive species introductions to the lakes, and the sort of rapid spread of invasive species is facilitated largely by the shipping that occurs exclusively on the lakes. So these boats called Lakers don't operate transoceanically. And as a result, they're largely exempt from ballast water regulations that are set by most regulatory bodies. So given that interest in seeing an increase of shipping, is there any sort of considerations for protections and closing loopholes for these Lakers in terms of their ballast water sanitation standards?
I will defer somewhat to Aaron on the ballast water because that's one of his favorite issues he works on. I'm not aware that, I guess it makes sense that ballast water could spread invasive species within the lakes. I think we've seen, though, with zebra mussels, quagga mussels are still not have been introduced into Lake Superior, so I wonder how much. Okay. I didn't know that much about that, but I think generally we have been supportive of increasing shipping on the lakes and trying to find better ways to do that. And I think that we're trying to deal with invasive species on a multitude of areas to try to find out ways where we can control the species. I think we have some like 180 invasive species currently in the Great Lakes. And so we've been trying to find ways through funding opportunities, through USGS and other ways to try to control these populations and see what their real impact is. I think it's what I've been told by the scientists is it's sometimes not always a clear-cut answer about how we're going to address invasive species. If you try to take one out, it might increase the population of the other, or okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, as Jordan mentioned, this has been a hot topic for about 25, going further back than that, 30 years. But so the Senate, yes, this is a pivotal issue. In fact, this may be, in terms of issues before the legislature right now, one could argue that has the largest ramifications for how, in fact, we are going to deal with the introduction and the spread of the invasive species. So when you mentioned the Lakers in particular, so earlier this year, the Senate it was tucked into a Coast Guard bill, a bill called VITA. And what that bill did was it removed the ability to EPA to regulate vessels using best available technology under the Clean Water Act. It also exempted, it exempted the Lakers, which was something that my boss and a lot of the members in the Great Lake Basin had some real trouble with. Luckily, Senator Stabenow, working with her colleagues, was able to defeat cloture on that bill. When we come back now since that time, that was around April, I believe, the Environment and Public Works Committee, really, true legal experts on the Clean Water Act. There were some real, there were a lot of members, including my own, that believes that the EPA is an expert and needs to retain their authorities under the Clean Water Act to determine what technologies are available. And I'm glad to say that after about 6 or 7 months of very, very difficult negotiations, when the Senate comes up, the first bill that we have is a compromise bill that does many things. And just to list off one, it preserves the ability of the EPA to determine the technologies that are best available and economically achievable under the Clean Water Act, which is very important. They are experts on discharges. I know some of my friends in the shipping industry don't like to say they're pollutants, but the courts have ruled that, in fact, ballast discharge it should be classified as a pollutant. So we were able to retain authority to regulate ballast water under the Clean Water Act. 2, there is no exemption for the Laker vessels. There was we had always, for a long time, there were people who would, when they would come in and talk to me about this, he says, "Oh, well, there's no evidence that Lakers are actually moving these invasives that are coming in because of the salties." So it's really it's really the issue with the folks coming in from the saltwater vessels. Well, there was because of the action by the state of Minnesota, which required the Lakers to do a study and actually have people on. they proved conclusively that what I think a lot of people had suspected was that the Laker fleet was spreading invasives throughout the Great Lakes, including bloody red shrimp, which I know CMU does a lot of work on that as well. So the Lakers are treated no differently than any other vessel, and there is significant opportunity for legal recourse. And I think the bill that, when it came up before, was inadequate in a lot of areas, and I think that the bill that will be coming before the Senate is something that is a significant improvement. It is not a step backwards, and I think actually a step forward in protecting the Great Lakes from ballast water discharges. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer. Yeah, sure.
Probably got time for one more question. I see a hand raised over there.
I think Dr. Davison made a great point about sausage making, and that was a great role. That was a great description of the public policy process. The fact of the matter is that these are highly complicated decisions, and they involve a multitude of factors. And I think as a staffer, your job is to provide your boss with a recommendation. You say, when I brief my boss, I say, Senator Stabenow, this is where I'd recommend. But equally important is, Senator Stabenow, here's what you understand is the other side of the argument. You are doing a disservice to your boss if she or he does not have the full information. They are elected. They are the ones who are voting. And so as a staffer, you try to provide the full picture for them so that they can make a decision that they feel is best for the people, for the country, and for the state they represent, and districts, excuse me.
Yeah, and I'll just expand on that too. You want the well-rounded input, regardless of where your personal views are. You want to have the big picture, and that can make it more complicated, but also very important.
One thing I'll just kind of add is that in the House, especially, a little bit different in the Senate because they're dealing with the whole state, but in the House, you really deal with extremely local issues like Flint, Oscoda, like what's happening in mid-Michigan. So I think what issues the congressman chooses to focus on or what lens he looks through a lot of ideas is through that. I mean, when we're thinking about what happens in the Great Lakes, we're thinking about how does this impact Saginaw Bay, which is an area of concern, and how does that impact our community? So I think that's the first thing. And then, scientists, if it's a science question sometimes, but not everything is maybe necessarily a science question, but it could be a social science question or what other experts believe is what could be a better policy to achieve the outcome that we're looking at. But I think really we focus a lot, especially in the House, but in the Senate, they have a lot more competing interests maybe throughout the state, but we really focus on what is happening in our part of the state.
Dr. Uzowski has indicated that we are in fact going to have one more question, so let's...
Well, we might have time for a few more, but I just want to thank you for talking about the importance of getting involved. And Jordan and Eva, we met with you with a group of students in Washington, D.C., and we do have opportunities, by the way, Dr. Davison, we have scholarships through the Department of Political Science and Public Administration for internships for a semester or a summer. In fact, you might know Erin Katie Conlon in Senator Peters' office. She's a proud alumna, and she went out there on the internship through the Washington Center and is continuing she stayed in D.C. to work for Senator Peters. But I want to just emphasize one thing, and it's because I think I'm a political scientist, that there are elections coming up. And I think that getting involved, it's possible to go out to D.C. and do an internship, and that's a very common way that young people get involved in politics. I was an intern way back when in Washington, D.C. But what about getting involved in elections locally? And I'm thinking of you, Jordan, if I remember correctly, the route that you took to get involved, as well as Mike, I believe, Taliga Eva, is that your chief of staff for Congressman Moolenaar? And I think that there are other routes available that really don't involve starting in DC, but getting involved in politics here and trying to make a difference locally here. And that starts, I think, with voting. And I hope that people will exercise that responsibility and vote in 3 weeks. Thanks.
Responses? I know you had some thoughts about the number of people who do vote.
No, yeah, I don't do politics, luckily. But yeah, no, yes, please vote. Vote, and that doesn't mean vote, Democrat, vote Republican. Get out there and vote. It is critical. I think, people often look, they see in D.C. and they see the fighting that's going on, and they see that lens, and you go, oh, wow, what is going on? I don't think what you're seeing a lot in the public debates and the news shows are actually where most people in this country are. Again, I'm not a political expert, but, if you take a look at the last election, roughly, I think 51 or 52% of people who are eligible to vote had voted. So of that, we are talking about 23% of those who have the ability to vote are the ones who determined the last election. Get out and vote, whatever that is. And I think any involvement you want to do on the grassroots is fantastic experience. But yeah, absolutely. Just to reiterate, please vote. It may not feel like it, but it has major consequences.
Add anything to that?
Good. Yeah. Thank you.
Tom, do you want to finish? Okay. And people are going to be back at 11, is that right?
Just take 5 minutes for us to turn over the table.
So this has been, I think, a very interesting session. Hopefully the audience has gained some insights into how Washington operates. Hopefully that's made you more rather than less interested, if not to get involved, to vote, to write to your representatives and express your opinions, because as you heard this morning, that's very important. And I hope the panel has also gained an appreciation of the depth of knowledge of many of our students in these really important issues. And so with that, we'll bring this panel to a close and thank the panelists once again. Thank you.